Hi, Donna here from Clever Crafting. Thanks for joining me today. So we're actually covering a couple of different processes today, and we're going to start off by stenciling this background. So this stencil here matches the stamp and die set that I'll be using today. And you can see that what I'm doing here is I'm just detacking my masking tape and putting it on my what's going to be the matte layer of my card. Now this stencil, of course, you can use either way, which is fine. And I'm just lining it up where I want the feathers on the background. And I'm just going to stick that into place. I normally like to use my silicone mat for this because then I don't have to stick it down, but I didn't bring it to my home studio, so I'm working without it today. I'm using distress oxides, although this process you don't have to use distress oxides, and I've chosen colors that is going to match with the little bird that I'll be using on the front. So I'm using squeezed lemonade and carved pumpkin, just to bring out the yellow and the orange that are in the bird. Now I'm also using finger daubers, and I am just dabbing it on lightly. I'm not going to sit and make you watch all of this. A couple of reasons that this has got to go, you've got to dab these, is because with this particular stencil, those fine bits don't have another end, aren't joined at both ends, which means that they can move. So if you're doing it with a brush, you might get underneath those. So I like to use a dauber to go on top and, like just pounce on it. You can use just a plain sponge if you want to, a makeup sponge, or even a cotton wool ball will work. I am putting this on fairly lightly because I don't want this to overtake my whole card. I just want it to be nice in the background. So I keep doing this whole piece in that squeeze lemonade, and there's the reveal you can see. But now I'm going to rearrange. I think I ended up flipping that stencil over, and I am just going to add some of the carved pumpkin. Now I don't actually even put any extra ink on this carved pumpkin because I don't want it really bright. I want it to be nice and subtle. So you can see that there. That looks quite tropical, doesn't it? But they're feathers and they're pretty. So there's our background done. Now I'm just going to pop that aside now to dry. Look at that. That looks really lovely, doesn't it? Okay, so here's our stamp set. So I am just going to choose which feather I'm going to use for my card today. Now there's 5 feathers, and then there's the little feather ring in that. So I'm just grabbing the feather that I want. You can see that when I try and fit it on the stencil, it was the wrong way. So there is a right way and a wrong way with the stencils when you want to match it up with your stamp. So that stamp there fits perfectly into that stencil, and that's that way. That's the correct way, and that's the feather that I want. So now I'm just going to make sure that all of those are down, and I've got that on a piece of scrap craft card. These sorts of things are great. Your embellishments or your focal points for your cards are really good to do on just some scrap card. So I'm going to use some Hero Arts Unicorn White because the craft card is a little bit darker. So I'm going to put down a layer of white first. So my colors, when I put the colors on it, will show up really nicely. Although distress oxides, you can put directly on a darker color anyway because of the properties. I'm really showing you this because if you're not using distress oxides, if you're going to be using a dye ink, another dye ink, then you'll need to have a white base. So you can see that I did the pouncing technique again. I did it fairly thickly, and I've got that lovely white feather. So that's all well and good if you've got Hero Arts Unicorn White ink, but if you don't, you can also use acrylic paint. So I thought I would show you that process as well. So I'm just going to bring out a scrap piece of cellophane. I love using the packaging for these sorts of things. And I'm going to use a makeup sponge on this because I don't want to put acrylic paint on my daubers, which is fine. So just going to grab a cheap makeup sponge. I buy these from Priceline or one of those places. Here in Australia you buy bags of them, so they're almost throwaway stuff. I do use mine until they're well and truly dead though. So here we go. I'm just putting, this is a smidgen. This is an absolute total smidge on this. You don't need a lot of paint. In actual fact, I don't even use all of that paint. With the paint, this is acrylic paint, a white acrylic paint. I think that this maybe cost me $3 from, Aldi or one of the $2 stores around town. And I am just putting, that's a dry sponge, and I'm putting a little bit on there. Now you really want a light coat of acrylic paint because you don't want it cracking or anything. So, and the difference between the paint and the dye is the paint is going to totally sit on top. It is not going to absorb into the card at all. So the Hero Arts Unicorn White is a pigment ink, so it also sits on the top, but it does get absorbed in to a certain extent, whereas paint will not. Totally different properties, so you have to be careful. So I'm not putting quite as thick a layer on it. You'll also notice when I take the stencil off that it's not quite as defined. It's a little bit fuzzy around the edges. It doesn't seem to matter what I do. I can't get it as crisp when I use the acrylic paint. Not that it's going to matter in the end result, to be honest, because by the time we're finished with it, it's going to look fabulous. All right, so I'm just going to take this off and clean it. This has to be washed in a sink because I use the acrylic paint on it. I've done all of that. My other piece is still drying. So now I've decided to work on making the base that I'm going to have my feather on. And, you know, I'm just going to have it on a bit of rubbish cardboard. So this was a box that something came in. So it was a nice fine box. It's got printing on the other side. And I am literally just ripping it to the size that I want it. Became a little bit tricky in a couple of times because it has plastic coating over the, you know, the outside of it, which made it a bit tricky to tear sometimes. So now what I'm doing is that I'm happy with the size. I'm actually ripping off the top layer so I can use the corrugations because it's corrugated cardboard that I want to use. I want to see it. So you can see that I'm just using my pokey tool. It's called an awl, by the way, underneath it and just going to rip it off. That's actually crazy satisfying doing that. I just want to say it's really quite fun. Once I'd done all of that, I decided it wasn't quite small enough, so I'm ripping a bit more off, as you can see there, and I was ripping off the plastic on the outside, you know, the plastic coating, and that's better for the size feather that I'm using. Okay, so now I've got my stencil after I'd cleaned it and dried it in paper towel, and I'm going to place this back over the top of my where I did the colouring before with the white ink. So if you heard that big bang, that was my husband in the kitchen. So we're just grabbing our dauber back, and I am going to just use this and pop it in the center. I make sure, because I want this to be a two-tone feather, so I'm just putting this squeezed lemonade, which is the same colors that we used on the background. I'm going to try and put them on a bit thicker and put it down the middle. Now the thing is that I used my heat gun to dry this a little bit and it curved up. So can you see it kept slipping? I left this in because, well, you know, we're all fallible, aren't we? And I've stuck that down now. I stuck my piece of scrap paper down, and I've sped this up so this particular section, so you're not watching me daub on top of this for ages. But I wanted to show you the whole process because I've put the yellow down the center, and then I'm going to use the carved pumpkin and put it around the edges, the outer edges of the feather. Now, I could have done this the other way if I wanted to. It's really up to you, and it really doesn't matter what inks you're using. You're going to put them on. I'm just putting both colors on. I could have splotched them all over the place if I'd wanted to. This was just the design that I wanted to use. So here I go with my carved pumpkin again, you know, like I'm putting that on the outsides. And you can see that that gives it that lovely soft color because it's on top of the white, and its color, you can see it's lovely. All right, I'm going to do exactly the same process on my painted one, which is the next one. You can see that the ink comes up quite bright on the second one. That's on the acrylic paint compared to the first one, which is a bit muted. So just be careful because that second one will stay wet for ages because the ink won't dry really well on top of that. So I've popped them in the sun, and now I'm using the number 3 out of my metric rectangles to just trim that card down a little bit. So the metric rectangles are designed to cut all of the metric sizes for an A6 card, so it'll have the perfect border around the outside. So this particular card's going to have a little bit bigger border because I chose number 3 instead of number 2. All right, and I've cut that down. So now I'm back to my stencil, and I've got my scrap card in my stamp pen stamping platform, and you can see that I'm putting my stencil directly over my feather. That is so I can line it up. My stamp is exactly the same size as my stencil, that feather. That's why I did that at the beginning, you know, checked out which stencil part I wanted to use with my feather. So now what I can do to make sure that I don't muck it up is I've lined the stencil over, I've positioned the feather stamp, I've inked it up with some VersaFine, which is just the one that I like, the black one that I like, and now I've stamped that over the top, and look at that. Isn't that beautiful? I'm going to do exactly the same with the other one. It just comes up so nicely, and you can see the other one's a little bit brighter, once again, because we use the different paint underneath. So I'm going to cut both of these feathers because I'm not exactly sure which one I'm going to use yet on my background. The muted one kind of matches the colors better, but the brighter one, you know, is nice. So here we go, putting it together. This is the fun part, the culmination of all of our hard work. I'm putting glue, using the Smart Art glue, stuck it all together there. Stuck everything on. The greeting is from another die set. I'll put links below for the things that I can. And I cut out 3 of them and stacked them on top of one another to make it, you know, a nice depth, to give it a little bit of oomph. And my bird, I put some foam double-sided tape underneath that. So, and oh, there we go. So that's our card today. I really hope you like it. It was so much fun to make. I ended up with 5 of them because, of course, we do a class with these as well, and I'm going to give them away as a set. So on the inside, I've popped some white card, and I've just stamped a little the matching feather on the inside. Just to add a little bit extra, I will also stamp the envelopes that go with it. And it might make a nice set. So I want to thank you for spending time with me again today. I really hope that you've learned something. That's very important to me. If you want to see some different versions of this card, hop on over to our Facebook group, because that's where we are. I'll put a link for that below. I'll also put a link below to my Clever Crafters face group page, so if you join that, then you'll know when this kit comes back into stock. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.